All right, welcome back to the concluding session of the Taming the Giant Corporation Conference. I'm going to conclude. All right. We working? Okay, we're going to conclude the session that we're going to conclude the conference with a session of a conversation between Amy Goodman and Ralph Nader. There's been a lot of talk again about the structure of corporations, the harms perpetrated by corporations, strategies to subordinate and displace corporations, the two overarching themes of the conference. But now we want to hopefully have a very engaged and detailed discussion about strategies and ways to move forward so that there's no sense in which the overarching power which we're talking about and facing and trying to confront and subordinate and displace leaves us feeling powerless. Because we do collectively have more power, as Ralph suggested earlier in the conference, if we organize to obtain it. I think that's some of what will emerge from the conversation that follows. Amy Goodman, as all of you know, is the host of Democracy Now! She's the hardest working journalist in this country. Russell Mokhiber and I wrote a column a while back saying that the CBS anchor job should have been given to Amy and not to Katie Couric. People thought we were joking. We weren't joking. That wasn't funny. That was serious. Amy's been doing, well, one thing about Democracy Now! That, I mean, people are listeners and they know, but I think what's so remarkable about the show is the breadth of issues that Amy covers, the diversity of people that she talks to, and her ability to go on the ground all across the country, all around the world, find victims of injustice and enable them to tell their stories and facilitate people coming together to build countervailing power, to take on large corporations and address fundamental issues of war and peace. Now, as it happens, Amy had a career before starting Democracy Now! A decade and a half ago, and it turns out she wrote a full issue of Multinational Monitor in 1985 based on work she had done in college, the case against Depo-Provera, a drug that was being pushed in the developing world with devastating consequences. She is now, in addition to the hosting Democracy Now!, the author of several books, most recently Static, subtitled Government Liars, Media Cheerleaders, and People Who Fight Back. She'll be interviewing Ralph Nader, the consumer advocate. Ralph has written many books of his own. One of the recent books is The Good Fight. And let me just say, in conclusion, before turning it over to the discussion, that this discussion and every part of the conference has been recorded, will be available on DVD. You can get information at the websites that are listed here, tamethecorporation.org and otherwise. And with that, let's turn it over to Amy and Ralph.
I think if asked, Ralph, most people would say today the most important issue of the day is war and peace. So why have a 3-day conference on the corporation?
Well, first of all, the corporations are very involved in the war machine. We remember President Eisenhower's statement about the military-industrial complex. He might have called it today the industrial-military complex, because the industrial part is now a supreme influence on the U.S. military budget, which now is half of the entire federal government's operating budget, and as well as affecting foreign policy. Even Mr. Koppel has written that oil is very much involved in the invasion of Iraq. In fact, he went to say it's mostly about oil in an op-ed in the New York Times, Ted Koppel. So the domination, the corporate sovereignty over our political economy is very much related to our foreign military and economic policy, including GATT and NAFTA, which are architectures of corporate supremacy over civil values and the rights of workers, environment, and consumers.
Can you recap from this conference of 3 days, people coming at corporations, dealing with them in many different ways, what you think are the biggest problems and the most effective strategies for dealing with them?
Well, the biggest problem is that the avenues to challenge corporate power, to restrain it, to break it up in its present concentrated form, to take it away from the political arena, because corporations are artificial entities. They're not real human beings. They don't vote. They don't die in Iraq. They don't have children. They are entities that are dominating our politics, our electoral systems, our universities increasingly, dominating almost everything, even moving into areas that were once prohibited by custom in our country, like commercializing childhood. And so this conference really challenges the corporations at every interface that affects people: taxpayers, consumers, workers, communities, children, health, care, living wage, the varieties of opportunities that people should have that are being denied. We are in the advanced stages of being a corporate state, where, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt warned Congress in 1938, that when government is controlled by private economic power, he called that fascism. And he would consider today's control by private economic power, namely giant corporations astride the world, as an even more advanced form of what he called fascism: control of government by corporate interests.
Would you call it fascism?
Yeah, the clinical definition is what he was saying. It was obviously colored in different contexts in World War II, but the clinical definition of fascism is when private concentrated economic power takes government away from the people, turns government into a guarantor, a subsidizor, a covering of corporate power. And corporations now have their executives in high government positions. They have 35,000 full-time lobbyists here, like the drug companies, getting all kinds of subsidies from Congress. And they have 10,000 political action committees. Now, if you look at the civic side, there's very little of that, although, as this conference showed, they've achieved an enormous amount, given their small numbers. I think basically if you could quantify corporate power and civic power in Washington, D.C., civic power is probably 1% of corporate power. And yet, look what it has achieved. And I think the hope coming out of this conference is not only that we have a lot of solutions that we don't apply in our country, because concentration of power in the hands of the few allows the few to decide for the many, but we have a large amount of unused democratic power, unused civic power, that can be unleashed, organized to take back our government if people stopped believing that they were powerless, which they are inbred in ever since we entered elementary school. You know the old phrase, you can't fight City Hall.
Just to understand how we've come to this point and where you feel people need to go, can you give a thumbnail sketch of the history of corporations in this country, how they gained this level of power?
Well, they were first chartered in their modern form, Massachusetts, when the textile companies wanted the corporate entity to give limited liability to their investors. And so they were chartered, each one at a time, into existence by the state legislature in Massachusetts. And that was in the early 19th century. And decade after decade, these corporations began to be powers in and of themselves. They were no longer, after a few decades, chartered by legislature. They were chartered by the state agencies. And in 1887, they got just what they wanted, a declaration by the Supreme Court, without even an argument by the head of the representative of the railroad in the Santa Clara case, a declaration by the Supreme Court that corporations, these private entities, would have the rights as persons, as human beings, under the Constitution. And then it was off to the races. Then every single right that human beings have under the Constitution was given to corporations, except the right against self-incrimination. And so, throughout American history, if you take every social justice movement, except the GI Bill of Rights, every social justice movement, whether it's anti-slavery, women's right to vote, the farmer populist movements, the worker movements in the early industries, and the drive for decency, justice, equal rights, proper livelihoods, health, safety, who said no? The overwhelming power who kept saying no to the abolition of slavery was the commercial interests, the cotton plantations. The chief opposition to women's rights were not just misogynists. It was the industries, because women were in the forefront of abolishing child labor and trying to advance social justice. And of course, who was against the farmer populist progressive movement? Most prominently, the banks and the railroads. And who was against the mine workers and the auto workers? It was the corporations. And in the 20th century, the same thing. Who were our main opponents in the environmental movement, the worker movement, the democracy movement, the clean elections movement, the health insurance for everybody movement? It's the corporations who have achieved the power to say no and make it stick. So doesn't that tell you what our priorities should be? If we want a society where people have the opportunity to fulfill life's possibilities, doesn't that tell you what the priorities are, which is focusing on subordinating the corporate entity to the sovereignty of the American people, as implied in the Constitution? So that they are our servants, not our masters, so that they have to compete against other models of economic development, like cooperatives, like replacing the HMO insurance companies with full Medicare, like decentralized solar, replacing more and more of Exxon and Peabody Coal and the nuclear industry, like a redefinition of efficiency and productivity as if people matter, not as if corporations dominate. They actually define our economic terms. And if we defined efficiency as if people mattered, we would have a massive energy efficiency program, which would, of course, reduce the sales of Exxon and Peabody Coal and Commonwealth Edison and all the rest, because we would be using less electricity and less gasoline, because we would democratize technology. Instead, we have what Andrew Kimbrough called at the conference, these giant corporations are dictatorships, and they have enormous power without anywhere near the commensurate responsibility. They are highly autocratic dictatorships that prevent constitutional rights from being with workers when they go to the workplace. They lose their constitutional rights when they enter that corporate domain. And because of all this, it is interesting that our political leaders don't like to discuss it. I mean, every politician in this town knows who runs this town. They know who runs the Defense Department, the Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture, Food and Drug Administration. And there are only a tiny handful of politicians who will raise the banner of subordinating corporate power to the sovereignty of the American people. The debates are sterile. The debates are exercises in parallel news conferences, repeating ad infinitum the same words and phrases of evasion. They will not confront the corporate crime wave. They will not confront the destruction of our democracy. They will not confront the usurpation of our electoral processes, even though they could go back to Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and others who have condemned corporate power as a perilous threat to even a modest democratic society.
So if corporations are dictatorships, you have a choice of regulating a dictatorship or getting rid of it.
Well, you've got to do all these things. So, for example, you have to strengthen the traditional tools that have curbed corporate crime, fraud, violence, outrages, bigotry, and these are regulation, adequate opportunity for litigation. These are antitrust, which has been caricatured, but it is a powerful tool if it's adequately applied. You have to give the owners, the mutual fund people, the pension shareholders more power. They are the owners of the corporation, but they have no power. Just imagine the violation of capitalist principles. These guys at the top who are paying themselves $10,000, $12,000 an hour in compensation to CEOs basically have repudiated the cardinal principle of capitalism, which is if you own property, you should control it. And now they have said to their owners, get lost. Don't dare tell us what we're going to pay ourselves. After all, we're only your hired hands. And so that's a very important front or initiative. We ask ourselves, why not more cooperatives? With the internet, you can develop cooperative purchasing and develop specifications for the kind of cars or the kind of insurance policies people should be able to buy. We need stronger trade unions. We need trade unions unlike SEIU. We need trade unions like the California Nurses Association, who see themselves as a powerful countervailing force.
Explain that difference.
SEIU is the inheritor of the tradition of company unionism.
The service employees,
yeah, the service employees. Andrew Stern. I mean, basically, he spends more. Sometimes you think he spends more time with corporate executives than he does with workers. He's constantly trying to collaborate with corporate executives in ways that weaken the morale, undermine the rights and horizons of workers. And most prominently, the way he signs these full-page ads with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and all the other corporate lobbyists saying, Americans should have universal health care. Yeah, more universal health care gouging, more universal health care exploitation, not full Medicare for all.
And the nurses?
The nurses want full Medicare for all. They want patient rights. They want adequate staffing in hospitals. They want to cut the giant compensation of these HMO CEOs down to appropriate size. They've run initiatives in California. They haven't won for full Medicare, but they represent what unionism should be. Flat-out representation, not just of workers, but also of consumers who workers serve.
So how do unions regain momentum, power, at one of their lowest points now in history?
One is they've got to mount an assault on the WTO and NAFTA. WTO and NAFTA are basically an albatross around the neck of workers, of consumers, and of clean environments to begin with. They are an end run around our courts and regulatory agencies. We couldn't have gotten airbags under WTO, because that would have been considered a unilateral move under this global trade agreement and a non-tariff trade barrier. It would be considered too high a standard imposed on importing cars, even though it's the same standard on domestically produced cars. What WTO does, it prevents us from being first in the world. It pulls down our standards, so our workers have to compete with brutalized child labor in third world countries. It makes us impossible to prohibit the importation of products from child labor. That's a violation of the WTO, even though you can't buy a product here in the U.S. made from child labor in the U.S. It is the greatest loss of sovereignty, local, state, and national, in American history, and it's an autocratic system with secret courts and secret equivalency procedures. I mean, it's just a total contradiction and subversion of our democratic society. So that's the first thing that has to be done, to invoke the 6-month notice of withdrawal and renegotiate pull-up trade agreements where we pull up the rest of the world and our standards instead of pull-down trade agreements that subordinate health and safety to trade agreements. That's the first time that's ever been done. Trade usually stuck to trade agreements. Now, they become very imperialist, and they subordinate health and safety, consumer, environmental, and worker rights. The second thing that has to be done is something no Democratic politician will ever utter, except maybe for Dennis Kucinich. Not one Democratic politician will say, we should repeal the notorious anti-worker Taft-Hartley law of 1947.
Explain what it is.
Which basically obstructs the organization of unions, which transfers control of union pension funds to management. With all these trillions of dollars, imagine the power that workers could have. They would own 1/3 of the New York Stock Exchange. They would be able to put real muscle in investor ownership, and it prevents workers from helping one another, called secondary boycotts, among many other notorious provisions. And to show you how bad it is, on the 50th anniversary of the Taft-Hartley law, I called up the AFL-CIO and wrote to the heads of the major unions in the United States saying, let us remind the American people and the American worker how important it is to repeal Taft-Hartley. And they wouldn't come along. They wouldn't have demonstrations. I told them there are 2 reporters, one labor reporter for the New York Times and Washington Post, looking for an event. Educate the young generation about this notorious anti-worker law. And they wouldn't go along. So again, it's the rank and file that has to take over their own union leadership. And the California Nurses Association is showing the way.
I wanted to ask you about the secret trade deals that are being made behind closed doors between the Democrats and the White House that reports say are being the language being drafted by the White House. Rick MacArthur, publisher of Harper's, said on Democracy Now! That Congressman Rangel, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi are saying we're gearing up for the 2008 election. We've got to raise a lot of money. They're closer to the Clinton wing of the party, which is the pro-so-called free trade wing of the party, the pro-NAFTA, pro-permanent normal trade relations with China part of the party. And this is a way of saying to the corporate community, Wall Street, Walmart, we're open for business. We want to raise money from you in order to compete for campaign money. The logic goes the Democrats have to cater to big corporate donors.
The corporate Democrats in action again. Why should we all be surprised? When you ask Democrats in Congress, how are you doing against the Republicans in the coming election? The first answer is about money. It's not about justice. It's not about agenda. It's not about mobilizing people. It's about dialing for corporate dollars. These 2 parties have sold the U.S. government and the American people to the highest bidders. And that's why we have a corporate sovereign political economy. And that's why workers are daily in peril of losing their economic security and their pensions and retirement, or their jobs, or their health and safety in the workplace. You know, we have to pay attention, Amy, to something very important, and that is the language. We are in the process of seeing the corporatization of our highways, the corporatization of our water systems, and still people on our side use the word privatization. They use the word white-collar crime instead of using the word corporate crime. They use the word private sector instead of corporate sector. We have to stop using the words of the opponents because they control the language. Democrats should use the words corporate welfare more often. They should talk about cracking down on corporate crime, fraud, and abuse that are ripping off Medicare and Medicaid and the U.S. taxpayer across the board. But you can say that ad infinitum, but they're not going to do it as long as they view their electoral processes in terms of dollar signs.
Can you talk about the corporatization of water?
Yes, this is an area you never thought the corporations would penetrate. You thought public drinking water systems in towns and villages and cities around the country represent a public function, that water shouldn't be for profit. It shouldn't be for sale like that. And because of the underinvestment in public drinking water systems, and we saw this even with our work on the Drinking Water Act of 1974, a lot of these systems have deteriorated. So instead of our government saying, let's divert some money from the enormously wasteful defense budget, let's start taxing corporate crime and corporate pollution and corporate speculation and get more revenue. For example, if you buy food, furniture, clothing, appliances, you pay a sales tax in this country, 6%, 7%. But if you buy $1 million of General Motors stock, you don't pay anything. So we can get revenue for public investment this way. If we just got rid of corporate welfare, that's several $100 billion a year. So it goes back into clinics, drinking water systems, libraries, public transit, the kind of necessities for ordinary Americans in their circulation and ordinary daily life. And so instead of doing that, along comes Goldman Sachs, along comes the Heritage Foundation, along comes the right-wingers in Congress and saying, hey, let's sell off these systems. Let's convert them so that there'll be enough investment to upgrade them. Well, the history of converting Atlanta's public water supply has been a disaster. It's been a disaster around the world. But it just shows you how brazen these corporations are. They're undermining parental authority, bypassing parents, selling these little kids junk food, junk drink, violent programming, all the things that aren't good for their little minds, and then teaching them how to nag the parents. So we are corporatizing our entire culture and society, in contradiction, I might add, of very well-appointed conservative values, not just progressive values, and every major religion in the world who's warned about giving its adherents too much power, and if they're merchants. Watch out, don't give too much power to the merchant class, because it's so singularly motivated and focused, it will trample the great human values of organized society. Not just health and safety or access to justice, but simply the freedom to work out problems between real human beings without the corporate supremacists taking over.
Ralph, let's talk about nabbing the elections. That's National Association of Broadcasters. The money you mentioned that these candidates are raising, tens of millions of dollars, will be well over $1 billion in 2008. What would you see as a different way for the media to play a role here? How do you see the media being challenged? Explain how the process works right now.
Right now, the media focuses on the horse race, who's raising the most money. The candidates who raise the most money get the most attention, they get the most specific polls, and the ones who aren't raising the money, even though their record is far superior and their rhetoric is far superior, like Dennis Kucinich and Mike Gravel, they don't get hardly any attention. So the networks and the mass media have bought into the wealth election. That's one. The second is they have made possible a private form of corporate government known as the Commission on Presidential Debate. So this commission was created in 1987, as you know, to get rid of the League of Women Voters, which sponsored presidential debates. And they went around, they got money from Philip Morris and Ford and AT&T and Coors Beer, and they now control the main gateway to tens of millions of Americans. No matter how many states you run in, as a third party or independent candidate, if you don't get on those debates, you don't reach tens of millions of people. And who is the gatekeeper? The Democrat and Republican parties, who even kept Ross Perot off in 1996 after he got 19 million votes in 1992. I called him up and I said, Ross, how's it feel for a billionaire to be excluded? He says, absolutely right. He said, I couldn't even buy 30 minutes of airtime. They refused him to buy 30 minutes of airtime so he could do his charts on, on the deficit. And yet, these TV stations are using our property. We own the public airways. We're the landlords. They're just tenants. And they use our property free. They don't pay as much as you pay for your auto license. And they decide who is on and who isn't on TV or on the national debate. So if you don't break that connection between the debate commission and ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, CNN, you can't break the power of this corporation called the debate commission and have more diverse debates with more voices and choices, which, by the way, the American people want. In the year 2000, at least 3 national polls had a majority of the people wanting me and Buchanan on the national debates. And I don't think that's just because people wanted to stay awake.
But the part of it you didn't mention is that this $2 billion that looks like will be raised for the 2008 elections, the majority of it goes to paying for ads.
Exactly. Yeah, the majority.
How could that
and then they make money, the networks and the stations make an enormous amount of money off of the candidates. I mean, it's really you really have to admire their ingenious, brazen nature. This is what the citizen movement has got to work on. just in terms of dynamic, complicated schemes to take over more and more of the people's power. These corporations and their law firms, it's like 24/7, just to keep up with them. And now they don't care if it's all on 60 Minutes or the mainstream media, as long as the mainstream media does not cover civic resistance movements or civic reconstruction movements, which they do very little of, locally, state, and national, except
Will
for
they be
Democracy
covering the
Now!
resistance to themselves?
Yes. They don't cover anything. They don't cover criticism of themselves. You have occasional congressional hearings on the media, as Jeff Chester has pointed out in his new book, and guess what? They don't cover it on the evening news. I often wonder, what if there's a major demonstration around every major television station in New York, rallying and making these points? They just surround the building with layers and layers of people and signs. I wonder if on the evening news, the television station would cover it. I mean, after all, there's weather to cover. There's sports to cover. There's 5 sequences of weather that starts in the Cascades and comes over the Alleghenies and, you know, all the suburbs, 51 degrees here, 52 degrees there. Why would they cover a demonstration? But that's something people out there should consider. Get a demonstration and surround the headquarters of the local TV station and see if they cover it. You have to show how brazen they are. They may cover it. Who knows? They may cover it. You never can tell. They're very adaptable.
On the issue of corporate power, let's go through the leading Democratic candidates and where they stand. Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Hillary Rodham Clinton is a corporatist. She's on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Didn't lift a finger against major, corrupt, unnecessary weapon system contracting or even weapon systems. Hey, there are people all over the Defense Department who think we should scrap the F-22, the Raptor, which is now over $250 billion program. The plane has gone from about 40 million to almost 200 million. You could put 2 or 3 of them in this room. And she's never taken on any of the corruption, the fraud, even though she complains that there's not enough money for children's programs. Well, she's on the Senate Armed Services Committee. She's signaling that she is going to play ball with the military-industrial complex. She's never taken a stand on corporate subsidies, handouts, giveaways, bailouts. You know, stadiums in New York subsidized by taxpayers, while so much in New York City is crumbling for lack of repair. And finally, she doesn't even do what Spitzer did. Her fellow Democrat gave her cover by prosecuting Wall Street crooks, rode all the way to the governorship in a landslide election based on his prosecuting corporate crooks. People like prosecuting corporate crooks. And she won't even sponsor tough corporate crime legislation and tougher penalties, law and order for corporate crooks in the U.S. Congress. So to be kind to her, one can summarize as saying she is severely lacking in political fortitude. She knows she's the front runner, and therefore she's going around the country pandering to powerful interest groups and flattering the people. Now, maybe they'll get tired of it after a while. Maybe they'll say enough is enough. Do we want 8 more years of the Clintons? And you know, you get a twofer.
What does that mean, 8 more years of the Clintons? How would you summarize the Clinton-Gore years?
The Clinton-Gore years where they further allowed and even encouraged with this reinventing government movement, the further consolidation of corporate power, agency by agency, department by department. 8 years went by, and there wasn't a single chemical control standard issued by OSHA, initiated by the Clinton administration. 58,000 American workers died from worker-related disease. You'd think they'd at least issue one, and there's a big backlog of them. There's been a lot of scientific work done. They didn't do it. They didn't issue one fuel efficiency standard. Where was Gore? Gore knew about this. He called the internal combustion engine in his first book that came out in 1992 a major threat to the planet. But when he was vice president, he was either muzzled or went along with Clinton, who right from the beginning signaled to the auto companies, you got a 4-year pass. In fact, we're going to spend $1 billion subsidizing a joint program, which was a complete waste of money, to develop some sort of improved engine efficiency, a partnership between the White House and the 3 auto companies. So the Clinton-Gore years were the final evidence that the Democratic Party is now a wholly owned subsidiary of giant corporations, with a few luminous exceptions, like George Miller, Dennis Kucinich, some of the older Democrats, Ed Markey, but even Ed Markey has lost some of his vigor in the telecommunications area. Washington, D.C. is corporate-occupied territory. The Democrat and Republican candidates are fighting against one another to see who's going to go into the White House and start taking orders from their corporate paymasters. When are we going to understand that either the people are going to control our government, or we're going to cede control increasingly to global corporations that have no allegiance to America, no allegiance to communities, other than to control them or abandon them as they see fit to communist China with the industries or elsewhere. I mean, we really have a very serious crisis in our country. People have to start making connections. They have to start spending more time, energy on their civic responsibilities from the local to the national to the global. And there are plenty of good citizen groups begging for more people to join their efforts to expand their resources.
You mentioned Al Gore. He's seen as the major voice now on the environment. I don't know if it's exactly on taking on corporations, but he was in power for 8 years. So what is your assessment of Gore candidate for president?
Gore has been environmentally reborn. He is experiencing important redemption. He is doing something very important. He's now basically a full-time citizen, alerting the world to the peril of global warming and getting some pretty muscular forces behind his efforts. Maybe he'll be restrained in terms of what needs to be done in terms of the democratization of technology and the expansion of solar energy. I stood in line waiting for the book signing when he came here in Washington. There were 300 people at a bookstore, and I just stood in line and finally got up to his desk. And he was very cordial. Anybody who thinks that the Greens cost Gore the election should ask Gore. He not only won the election, he knows how it was stolen from him, and he knows he made some very serious failures himself, including not winning his own state of Tennessee, which would have put him in the White House. But he's very cordial, and I said to him, Al, because I've known him since years ago, I said, Al, how's it feel to be liberated? He said, very good. And that's really the description of his present state. It's quite a testimony. When he had real power, he couldn't deploy it.
You're saying he's reborn now, but he wrote that critical book in 1992, The Fate of the Earth. So that was before during that time he was in office. If he were to become president, what makes you think he would remain reborn?
He wouldn't. The only politicians who are liberated once they're elected are those who come out of mass movements, so that they know who they're accountable for. And we have an electoral system where everybody tosses their hat in the ring and then goes around trying to raise money and expects people to be spectators on their campaign voyages through their cities and states instead of participants. That's what they do. They don't campaign with the people, with the citizen groups, with the struggles at the local level against pig farms or blowing off mountaintops for the coal industry or the south central LA and the poverty and so on. They parade in front of the people. And that's no way to win elected office and expect to represent the people.
Barack Obama.
Great capacity. He knows the score. He knows who has power in the country. He was a community organizer in Chicago after a sterling record at the Harvard Law School. He could have gone and cashed in. But as he said in his book, how can you keep raising that kind of money from those kind of interests and not have it affect you? And he's now in a race with Hillary to raise $300 million. He's trying to do a lot of it on the internet in small amounts. But he's going to one economic sector interest after another, raising money. And so the question is whether he's going to mobilize the people or he's going to parade in front of the people. And if he does that, he's not going to be a distinguished winner if he wins. I was very upset the other day when I heard him say publicly that he wanted to expand and modernize the military. I mean, really, the military needs more Trident submarines. Huh? It needs more aircraft carriers. It's already half of the budget, the operating budget of the U.S. government. And there's no major enemy left. The Soviet Union is gone, unless you think Moldova is a threat. And communist China is converting from criminal communism to criminal capitalism. They want our jobs and industry. They're not going to send missiles over here. So, of course, other perils are being wildly exaggerated and provoked into further expansion. The so-called war on terrorism and the criminal war in Iraq, which even Bush's CIA chief and General Casey and others have said are provoking the insurgency, enlarging it, and attracting more people to be trained in sabotage and terrorism from other countries. That's a real powerful anti-terrorist policy. You pursue a policy against terrorists with state terrorism. You pursue a policy against terrorists and expand the number of terrorism. I mean, this should be a concept that could be easily enveloped by the limited mind of George W. Bush.
John Edwards.
Edwards making a good point on poverty. That was a no-no with Democratic diplomacy. When you look at Clinton's speeches, it's all middle class. He never would say poverty. He never talk about 50 million Americans in real poverty and tens of millions of more Americans in a category called near poverty. And he's got to become much more populist. in a much more specific way. He should become the solar energy candidate. He should become the free communications candidate. He should become the affordable housing. More specific, not just, you know, the two Americas. And above all, he should become the law enforcement candidate against the corporate outlaws, the corporate exploiters. And he knows how to do that, but, you know, he has to raise money too.
Rudolph Giuliani.
And I might add, he's not good on foreign policy. Edwards is not good on foreign. Rudy Giuliani is the one-note candidate. And no one has ever made more political capital out of what one might be called 9/11 show-upmanship. I mean, what did he really do? He showed up, which is quicker than Bush did, right? He did nothing for the massive contamination of the lungs of the firefighters. In fact, he opposed their full compensation rights, or the police, or the volunteers. He just turned his back on these people. There have been very good books written deflating the fraud of Rudy Giuliani. He's also an authoritarian candidate. Don't bet your civil liberties on Giuliani. He thinks the Patriot Act is weak. So there's a real authoritarian language. If you look at the language that he's conveying around the country, it's frightening.
John McCain.
John McCain, he's good on auto safety. He tries to do something on campaign finance reform, although he plays the game and has to raise it from the K Street lobbyists. He's terrible on the war. I don't know what got into this mind of his. I mean, he had great authority to be as good as Senator Chuck Hagel on it and to say it was the wrong war, and he could have opposed it, but he's stuck. And that's why he's going to have trouble even getting a nomination. And if he gets it, he's not going to get elected. The American people will not elect a Republican in 2008, but they will definitely not elect a Republican who is for continuing the war in Iraq. 70% of the American people will not want out of Iraq. That means a very sizable chunk of conservative voters want out of Iraq. And all the Republican candidates of any significance that are running, want to continue that war. They want victory.
The unannounced, Fred Thompson, Mayor Bloomberg.
Bloomberg is the wild card. He could easily turn it into a three-way race if he runs as an independent. There's talk of a Bloomberg Senator Hagel ticket, and that could not just be another Perot rerun. It could really be a winning ticket. You know, Bloomberg is a surprise to most people. He's got a Republican label. He's a former registered Democrat. I don't think he's good on corporate welfare, but he's got a way where he could really appeal to people who call themselves Republicans, independents, Democrats. He is big business, so he's not afraid to talk turkey to them if he wants to. Nobody can say he didn't meet a payroll, but we're still waiting to see whether the inside Bloomberg office talk about running is actually going to materialize.
The independent unannounced, Ralph Nader.
Too early to say. It's too early to say. If I was going to run, and I have not decided at all, the biggest problem is getting on the ballot. The Democrats filed 21 phony suits against us. We won most of them, but it was very draining. In Pennsylvania, they got a Democratic judge using a Republican law firm, Reed Smith, to assess me and Peter Cameo $81,000 in transcription costs and handwriting expert fees for defending our right to be on the ballot, which they got us off through all kinds of shenanigans. First people in American legal history who had to pay court costs for defending the right to be on the ballot. So ballot access obstructions is the political bigotry of American politics. It's very hard to get liberals who love civil rights and civil liberties and who are Democrats to be at all excited about the systemic obstruction of 50 state laws at one level or another that can be used by either Democrat or Republicans against third-party candidates. And historically, Amy, that's where all the great ideas came from. In the 19th century, it was the anti-slavery party, the women's suffrage party, the farmer party, you know, all the things we read about briefly in our history books that pushed these social justice movements before one or both of the two parties picked up on them. So they're really, you know what I like to say? What would happen to nature if it prohibited seeds from sprouting? What would happen if big business could totally extinguish small business? That's what the big two-party elected dictatorship is doing to a whole array of local, state, and national candidates who would like to give the American people more voices and choices.
So I asked you about individuals running, but you talked about individuals being a part of mass movements. What about the many people in this country who are not running, but do want to determine who represents them? How do you think mass movements should organize themselves and hold politicians accountable, make them more accountable to citizen, civilian, non-citizen movements than corporations?
Well, let's start with the easy things, like half of democracy is showing up. So why don't workers who have lost their jobs or their pensions to industries that have gone to communist China with U.S. Department of Commerce subsidy and encouragement, why don't they mass and rally? I mean, who's keeping them from rallying and massing? American Idol? Is that what's doing it? I mean, let's stop making excuses for ourselves. Let's take the farmers, the dwindling number of farmers. They have great, important causes that mesh with environmental causes at times, and the whole issue of genetic engineering and the dispossession of the small family farm by the big suppliers, corporations, and the big buying corporations. Why don't they come to Washington the way they did 20 years ago with their tractors? Show up. Why, for example, can't a coalition of existing groups, the Urban Coalition, the NAACP, the trade unions, the consumer, the environmental groups, the neighborhood groups in each city, sponsor auditorium sessions for the major candidates or whatever candidates they want to invite that are going through New York or Boston or Houston or Denver or Los Angeles or St. Louis or Miami? They couldn't turn them down. And they could say, we want you to be here at the auditorium to respond to our agenda. We're the ones who are going to say no. We're the ones who are going to say yes. We know about your agenda. It's very abstract, and we can always get it on the website. We want you to react to our agenda. Now, is that hard to do? They couldn't turn it down because all of these coalitions struggling to piecemeal improve conditions in their communities represent hundreds of thousands of people. Now, is that too hard to do? I mean, this whole idea of rationalizing our futility has got to stop. We have far more unused rights and powers already left in this country that we're not using.
How do people get involved in the elections? You say people should show up, people should be organized, without just furthering supporting an individual candidate who's beholden to no one, whether they're Republican or Democrat, and not challenging the whole issue of raising what is expected to be more than $2 billion for 2008 for the elections.
The first step is to get rid of the least worst voting mentality, because a lot of people who vote Republican, Democrat, they don't particularly like the parties, but they know one is going to win, so they vote for the least worst. The minute you are a least worst voter, and your greatest concern is the worst of the least worst, you basically tell the least worst candidate that that candidate can take your vote for granted because you're not going to make any demands and you got nowhere to go. So the voters have got to start asking themselves, how can we condition our vote? So when you get a coalition in a city, like I just mentioned, inviting the candidates to their auditoriums, covered by local press, the demands are made in that fashion. In year 2004, we looked up 19 groups that supported Carrie Edwards. They were environmental groups, poverty groups, women's rights groups, all of the labor groups. Not one of them made any demand on Carrie Edwards. Why? Because they're so freaked out by Bush. Therefore, by not making Kerry better, they allowed Kerry to be worse, pulled by the corporate interests 24/7, who don't have this kind of squeamishness. And therefore, there weren't enough bright lines between Kerry and Bush, and there was a lot of waffling by Kerry Edwards, and in the first debate, he out-hawked Bush on Iraq. We'll never pull out of Fallujah. And 2 months later, after the election, Bush obliterated Fallujah. That's nice cover by the Democrats. So you have to make demands on your least worst if you don't want to vote for an alternative candidate. And those demands in many of these elections would be very, very compelling. They can't turn down these kinds of existing liberal coalitions.
Have the corporations won?
Well, they've won and they're winning, but they can be defeated. They can be overcome. They can be displaced by all the things I just mentioned. The sun is a great displacer of the oil cartel. If only the sun could speak.
WorldCom, Enron, what have they taught us? And what do you think is the most effective strategy that you've seen at the smallest community level or at a global level for taking on these greatest powers on earth?
Well, first of all, they're very powerful because there's a minimal organized resistance. There's a lot of criticism. Poll after poll shows the people are turned off on the issue of the pollution of their surroundings, the degradation of their working situation, the abandonment of the country, the commercialization of their children, etc. It's not organized. So it's got try organization, try going with the existing groups that are small and make them more and more powerful. The conference that we've just concluded on taming the giant corporation was full of suggestions of what's going on. But you see, they're not exactly glamorous. They're not highly sensual. That's the problem in democracy, that the most important quests are often described as dull.
Run through them.
Well, for example, a local credit union in a poor area in a city that is reviving the neighborhood, the democratization of credit, a developmental credit union. For example, the expansion of farmer markets, where food is grown close to where people live and not transported thousands of miles and therefore subjected to all kind of processing chemicals and loss of nutrition. That's expanding too. We've got buildings that are being built with greater energy efficiency. They're not being aggregated enough. And if you don't aggregate them, you don't build morale. Like we hear a lot about Exxon and their pollution, and we can't hear enough. But do we hear about the Interface Corporation in Atlanta, the largest carpet tile manufacturer in the United States, with plants here and abroad? The head of that company, Roy Anderson, has, since 1994, moved the company toward the goal of zero pollution and 100% recycling. In so doing, he's reduced his own costs and thrown the gauntlet to the other corporations with the message: by respecting the earth and not pillaging the earth and recycling and cutting pollution, you actually reduce expenses, improve worker morale, and make more money. Yet, you don't see that widely publicized. So we're not publicizing the operating models of superior performance sufficiently. You do that on your program once in a while, but look at the average nightly television news. I mean, how do you satire satire? It's a caricature of itself. So community radio increasing. There are a lot of things that Garel Perovitz has put in his book. But we need a broader concept, which is that we have to displace the corporate sovereign political economy. And I use the word political economy because it's politics and economics they dominate. We have to implement what Business Week magazine said in an editorial in the year 2000, quote, corporations should get out of politics, end quote, exact words. This is the major business magazine in America. And we have to stop making excuses for ourselves and put some real material reality in the old song, "The People Have the Power," by Patti Smith, because they do have the power. And they only have the power if they believe they have the power. But if they absorb the corporate party line, forget it, you don't count, you can't make change, you have to hit 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, hit button 1, 2, 3, and just be basically a compliant serf, because you may be discomforted if you take on big business. Then the companies don't have to work overtime to overpower the people. The people have overpowered themselves.
I want to end with healthcare. I think one of the critical issues of the day that is so rarely explained. If there was a healthcare system in this country that you designed, what would it look like?
Well, it would look like full Medicare for everybody, whereby the government is the payor. The government now pays over 50% of the healthcare bill. Huge amount of waste and fraud inflicted by these corporations on Medicare and Medicaid, for example. Drug companies getting all kinds of corporate subsidies. So the government is already over 50%, federal, state, and local government. So it's full government. It's called a single payer, which means it can almost eliminate $200 billion of computerized billing fraud and abuse, which has been documented by the General Accounting Office and by the leading expert on this, who should be on your program, Malcolm Sparrow, a lecturer at Harvard University. And when I said 200 billion, Mr. Sparrow, every year, he said that's the lowest estimate. That's just computerized billing, fraud, and abuse in the healthcare industry. It would dramatically reduce administrative expenses. Dr. was at the hearing yesterday, I guess, and she said that the per capita administrative expense in this country in healthcare is almost $1,900. In Canada, it's under $500. So it's more efficient. It's less corporate crime. It covers everybody. It saves lives. 18,000 people die in this country, according to the Institute of Medicine, because they can't afford health care. That's 6 9/11s every year. And the outcomes are better. In Western countries, the outcomes in terms of infant mortality, in terms of life expectancy, in terms of lower levels of anxiety, they don't have to worry about losing their life savings for a tragic illness, are all better than the United States system.
And what do you think it would take to achieve this?
It would take about 1 million people spending 800 million hours over a period of 2 years in key congressional districts. You got about 25% of the Congress already for it. And once the Washington politicos hear the rumble of the people, you will see a change that will surprise even the cynics among us. They've got to hear the rumble of the people. And about 2,000 organized people in each congressional district connecting with a popular sentiment that's all for this. And they can give you chapter and verse in their own family in terms of tragedies due to the healthcare system, denial, malpractice, corruption, insensitivity, deferral. It can happen. You know, we should always remember Richard Nixon. He came into office in 1969, and all he could do was hear the rumble of the people. And he was so scared of liberals, people called him paranoid. The liberals themselves were surprised how scared he was of liberals. And the, quote, liberal media. You remember? Well, look what he did. Because he heard the rumble of the people from the great demonstrations in the 60s and early 70s, he signed EPA into law, OSHA into law. He had a health care proposal far better than Clinton's. Didn't make it through Congress. He had an anti-poverty program that had a national minimum income for the poor Americans. Didn't make it through Congress. He had a drug control law that focused more on health than on incarceration. And he supported voting rights in Congress with the District of Columbia. Now, you think he believed all this? He heard the rumble of the people, and we all got to be part of that rumble. And the first thing we can get, and the fastest thing we can get, is full Medicare for all. People understand Medicare, which is being sliced and undermined and depleted, of course, with the recent legislation, where the government subsidizes gouging corporations to undermine Medicare. They actually use your tax dollars to undermine Medicare and make more profit for these corporations. That's what the Democrats somehow couldn't stop in Congress a couple years ago. Like they couldn't stop the tax cuts for the wealthy or the war. But that's the first thing we can get, because it's perceived as necessary, as life-saving by so many people. Every Western country has a version of it, including Canada. But whenever you propose full Medicare in this town, back come the people who even support it and say, it ain't going to happen. How many times do they say, it ain't going to happen? What do you mean it ain't going to happen? You got to show the rumble of the people. They'll make it happen.
Last question before you end with a few words, Ralph. Does George W. Bush matter anymore?
Yeah, he matters because he's a national security menace. He's a destroyer of our Constitution, a violator of our statutes, a revoker of our regulations. He's a warmonger. He is a war criminal, clinically a war criminal, and he's still in charge. And as I said some time ago, he's a giant corporation in the White House masquerading as a human being. Although I sometimes wonder about the word human. I don't think it's possible to see a more obsessively compulsed person with so much contempt for the traditions of our country, including conservative traditions. That's why so many libertarians and conservatives like Pat Buchanan have opposed him again and again. What's important is to basically get back to self-determination. Do we really believe in self-government? Do we really believe in accountable government? And do we really believe that the supremacy of the people has to be reinstalled over the supremacy of what Jefferson called the moneyed interests, in which today are the giant corporations? And I think that in addition to the various tools of accountability that we've discussed here at this conference, such as regulation, litigation, investor power, public delivery systems, when the corporations aren't interested, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, stronger labor unions, organized consumers, cooperatives. Here's what we really need in a broad sense. We need to exercise the ownership that we already have of the great public assets of the United States of America, from the public airways to the public lands to the government's research and development to trillions of dollars of labor pension funds, all of which are owned by the people and controlled by corporations. And so that's no big deal, theoretically, is it? To revert control back to the owners? That's a basic conservative principle. The second thing we have to do is increasingly displace the operations of corporations with better operations. More efficient energy, more renewable energy, more credit unions that are accountable to their small investors, more Medicare replacing the HMOs. All over the country we see examples of displacement of corporation. And that is really a very powerful and exciting movement if it obtains a magnitude of significance. And then the third, we have to structurally, constitutionally, every way subordinate this robot called the corporate entity, not its employees or its people. The robot has to be subordinated to the supremacy of human rights of real individuals. And that shouldn't be a hard sell either if we start talking about these things more often. If we don't leave it up to Democracy Now! To talk about it. If we don't leave it up to an occasional TV, you know, an occasional TV, very occasional TV. We have to increase our expectation levels. It all starts with increasing our expectation levels of what kind of society we want and what kind of world we want to bequeath to our descendants. If we're not motivated enough by the past great reformers and civic patriots of our past, the fighters against slavery and women's rights and all the rest of the social justice, if that isn't enough to motivate us, then let's look around this country and see the tragedies, the dispossession, the injustice, the exclusions, the disrespect, the gouging, the rip-offs, the using of taxpayer dollars against those small taxpayers themselves, the lack of health and safety, the hundreds of thousands of lives lost every year in occupational disease, and medical malpractice, and air and water pollution, and denial of health care, and so on. Who weeps for those people? And we have to stop making excuses for ourselves. That's the key. We have to multiply our own civic energies with our neighbors, our relatives, our co-workers, our friends. When that happens, when word of mouth takes over as the prime communication system in this country, nothing can stop it. We have to replace big talk with small talk. And we have to make it apparent to millions of people that striving for justice is one of life's greatest gratifications. In fact, outside of the family, it is the greatest gratification. Without justice, there's no such thing as liberty and freedom. There's no such thing as fulfilling life's possibilities. And I want to thank the people who came to this conference and lent us their energies and energized themselves, and hope they'll go throughout the country and do the same thing. Thank you.